Welcome to another episode of Tell Me More. I'm Luke Stehr. Today, Dr. Wiles and I have a great conversation about Colossians 3 and the things that we don't need in our lives and the things that we need to put on as Christians. We hope you enjoy it. Well, it's time for Tell Me More. It's full disclosure, it's not Monday.
That's right.
It's Tuesday, and because it's Tuesday this week, Katie Reed Hodges is not with us, which is sad. We miss her when she's gone.
But sad emoji, right?
Sad face emoji. Is
but
it sad emoji or
oh,
sad face
sad
emoji?
Sad face, I think, yeah. But we're happy for her.
We are happy for her. She is participating in something called the Junia Network, which is part of the Ascent movement, which our church belongs to. And it's this network for high-capacity women leaders in ministry. So her and Ashley are currently on their way to somewhere in Wisconsin.
Yes.
To go join with other high-level women ministry leaders from around North America.
Named for one of the apostles in the New Testament.
Yes.
Junia.
Romans 16. It's there.
Just
if
saying.
your Bible says Junius, go buy a new Bible.
Yeah, that's right. It's Junia. Female.
I make that joke. It's kind of a joke. It's not really a joke, but there was like several thousand years where that word, that name got frequently mistranslated as Junius and actually made it into most English translations for a long, long time, even though the earliest manuscripts have Junia. But
Female.
But I'm getting really nerdy. This is an aside. One of my final papers in seminary was over this chapter, if you can't tell. But around the 10th century, people started assuming, there's no way Paul would have thought a woman could be an apostle. Right. So they changed the name to Junius, even though there's no such Latin name.
Right.
And then it got popularized under Martin Luther, and it made it all the way into the Protestant canon for centuries. So if your Bible says Junius,
be careful.
Be careful. You might just need a Bible that uses the oldest, best manuscripts.
That's right. Exactly.
So we've talked about that before. We don't have to go into that again. We're going to talk about Colossians 3.
We are, aren't
and
we?
Everything that's going on in the life of our church.
Yes, because this podcast is actually brought to you by First Baptist Arlington.
Turns out.
So what's going on in First Baptist Arlington? Luke, what would you say?
I think camp, which I've heard is not a big deal, is coming.
Yeah, this will be my, let's see.
How many times have you been to camp with our church?
My 23rd. Yeah, this time. Because when I first got here, I arrived, I preached in July, so I just missed camp. If that makes sense, when I preached at Viva Call. And so, but I've been doing the rest of them, so yeah. I think.
And you are the preacher for children's camp this year.
I am camp pastor pretty much every year since I've been here. I've been the camp pastor for children. There was one year when, I can't remember if it was Josiah or Hannah, was graduation stuff happening with them. But yeah, I'll be the camp pastor again, and that's always fun. And we're going to talk about a life that's overflowing. So it's kind of a shout out to flourishing for our children.
It's a good way to talk about it for kids.
Yeah. So we're going to look at John, the stories of David, and then John 10 about Jesus coming to give us life that's abundant. So yeah. And then youth camp will be the next week, and we have, I think there's 16 churches that have come together to form the youth camp this year, but we're in charge of it. So
it's really impressive.
Yeah, it really is. It's incredible. So yeah, that'll be happening.
Give Chelsea and Tanner and Amanda a big round of applause.
It is right. Yeah, and David and Susanna and their crew. It's just amazing because we also are in charge of children's camp. I think it's 10 churches at children's camp. I may be wrong about that. I think that's right. But it's somewhere around 500 and, 50 children and then over 600 youth. So
it's a big deal. It's exciting.
It is.
Be praying for
all
all of that.
Once again, awesome.
And so we are fresh on the heels of High School Senior Sunday.
Yeah. Sweet day, wasn't it?
Yes, and especially sweet for you this year.
Yeah.
Not that it's not sweet every year, but
of course.
You, for those who don't know, had a grandson who got recognized.
Yeah.
How was that?
First grandchild to graduate from high school, and it was awesome. A little emotional in some ways, I guess, but excited for him. And I actually drive my two oldest grandsons to school every day, and so we talked about it yesterday and today as well. This is the last week. One of them's a junior, one of them's a senior. So the one that's a senior, Connor, we were just laughing today in the car that, okay, today's Tuesday, so 3 more days, and he's done. So,
how many years have you been driving them to school?
This year, I've picked him up through the years. This is the only year I've driven them actually to school, and so, yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about, Sunday morning I preached a sermon on fashion design. And it's been interesting because if you drive up to Arlington High School every morning,
I've driven by it.
It is, it's every fashion you can think about is on display in a high school today, an urban high school in the morning. It is really interesting, and all kinds of kids. And it looks to me like there's not really a trend. I think everything is in. Because I noticed that, like, some of the girls in particular, not guys, but some of the girls wear bell-bottom jeans. I haven't seen any guys wearing bell-bottom jeans. We wore them when I was in high school. But, for a while, it's basically, I always thought, straight legs, skinny jeans. And you still have a lot of that. But it's been interesting to see how many kids I've seen wearing bell-bottom jeans, which I thought was kind of out of vogue, but evidently it's okay now. And not only that, every color goes with every color now. So there's not like you don't have to have a palette of matching colors.
If it makes you feel better, I don't understand it either.
So it's interesting to watch it, but it's awesome. It's fun. I love it, and it's being with these kids, these teenagers, listening to them, and there's a young man that I often give a ride to as well. One of their really good friends. He has younger siblings, so he needs a ride to school every day. So we usually take him also, and he calls me Poppy also, so it's kind of cute. But yeah, it's fun. Learn a lot on the drive to school with 3 teenage boys.
Is there a lesson you can repeat?
No,
for the podcast?
Not yet. I've learned some lingo that I didn't quite know what it was, but anyway, I've been more educated.
That's probably not a bad thing.
No, I don't think so. But it's informed me a little bit. I haven't yet it's not pulpit worthy in terms of, but it does inform the preacher.
Is some of it that filthy talk that you mentioned from the pulpit?
I don't know about that, but it's just interesting. No, it's good. I love them, and it's fun.
Good.
So, but yeah, it's hard to believe that the clock is ticking though. So yeah, and then you fall into the summer, and it's great. And just the cool thing for me Sunday was not just Connor. A fair number of those kids, I actually was, the pastor here when they were dedicated as babies. And so now here they are, walking across that front of the church with their gowns on and graduating from high school. And so, but I've been here long enough to where that's just true every time now, So, yeah, it's sweet, though.
It is sweet.
Yeah, so it was just a good, sweet day. And this coming weekend, Memorial Day, and, we'll be grateful for the sacrifices that have been made for us to have the freedoms that we enjoy, obviously, and we'll do that. And also our director, our leader of Ascent, which is this new missional movement that we've become a part of, he's going to be in town. Chris Backert is his name. He'll be here Sunday, and we're going to have him meet with some of our leaders and staff and talk a little bit more about Ascent and learn more about it. So we've just got a really... I think a great weekend planned. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Great end to the month of May.
And we'll be in Colossians 3 again Sunday. So 3 weeks in Colossians 3, you could, but you could spend more time than that. And it is so rich, so, and using a different aspect of it each week. Next week, we're going to talk about community and what it means to live in community, how relational all these terms are these virtues are all relational virtues. But this past Sunday, it was about fashion, and so, yeah, interesting.
Would you consider yourself a fashionable person?
I don't know. I would say that I sometimes pay attention to it. How about that?
That's fair.
I think that's for somebody else to judge, right? Then for you to.
I'm not going to judge it for you. Yeah. I'm not going to judge it for myself either. But it was a great sermon. Preached very well in a very warm sanctuary. So if you were online.
Yeah, we had one of our pumps on our air conditioning that was out Sunday morning. And yeah, Andy was pretty upset about it because we've spent so much money on this air conditioning system, as you know. But some of the corollaries that are connected to it are still old, and that building was built in 1959. So it's not, even though we were able to replace everything, you wouldn't build what we have. In other words, they don't build what we have anymore,
right?
If that makes sense. Everything has to be retrofitted to go into our sanctuary and our oldest education building, because they just don't make those kind of systems really anymore. So I'm just proud of them that they can even get it going as well as they can. So,
yeah. So not how it was supposed to be, but
right.
Still a good Sunday.
Yeah.
Really
Sweet
important
day.
Sunday.
Yeah. And,
but I loved the way that you use this kind of idea of clothing, of putting these things on, or actually taking things off and then
first.
putting things off. So,
yeah, and putting some things to death.
Putting some things to death. Spending some time lately, I've been reading a book called Jesus Changes Everything by Stanley Hauerwas. It was recommended by a man you brought to speak to our staff recently, so I picked it up. It's a great book. But one of the things
I've not read that one yet.
It has been very good and thought-provoking. It's a little more devotional. We're getting nerdy again. Hauerwas can be a little heady.
I was about to say, normally, I don't think of him as being a devotional writer, but that's okay.
He can also be a little bit gruff.
Yeah, but that's his role, right?
It is.
He's a little provocative.
So it's still provocative, but a little more of a devotional writing style. But one of the things he talks about is Jesus doesn't just want admirers; he wants disciples. He wants people who are ready to come to the cross and put these things to death and follow him, not because it's what works in the world necessarily, because some of these things that Jesus tells you to do are going to put you in situations that maybe don't make you look successful by the world's standards.
The opposite, right?
Yeah. But so this call to not just be an admirer of Jesus, but to be a disciple, to be someone who follows him even to the cross, has been a really good insight for me in my life and my own devotional reading, and then to hear it affirmed through the lens of Colossians 3 on Sunday morning. It was a great tie-in for me. I was wondering if you'd want to talk more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, I appreciate how Paul launches Colossians 3 after he's done a good bit of explanation in the first 2 pages, and then it's this since then or now then or, therefore or because of all of this, just realize you as a Christian, you have been co-resurrected with Christ, really. You've been raised up to live somewhat in another dimension, to acknowledge and recognize another dimension. And so to me, I love that imagery. It connects to, I believe, inaugurated eschatology, this whole idea of the now and the not yet, and the sense that we've, the way Paul in this text, he uses the imagery of the new and the old, or the above and below, which to me, all of those are the now and the not yet. They're all pretty much saying the very same thing. But this idea that because we've been raised with Christ, that means our heart, our minds, our affections are to be set on the things that are appropriate for that kind of life, as opposed to the life prior to our relationship with Jesus, prior to the fact that Jesus changed everything for us. You could live a certain way. And I think Paul, too, was writing into such a pagan society. Think about, for many of these people, okay, you lived this way, and now you're going to be called to live this way. Like even in kind of the companion letter to Colossians is the letter to Philemon, and how Onesimus, who was this slave of Philemon, escaped, fled, what would you say?
He was a runaway slave.
Just ran away from his responsibility, which was not well thought of in those days. And so then Paul meets Onesimus in Rome, and Onesimus is now converted to Christianity out of a pagan life. And now the question is, what should he do now? How has his life really changed? And Paul is going to send him back to Colossae, to Philemon.
Which is a master class of an epistle, by the way.
It's incredible when you read it. And it connects here to Colossians. And to think about, so Paul is actually describing something that both Philemon and Onesimus have experienced, this radical life change out of these pagan backgrounds. and now they're in a situation where one of them has offended the other, if you will.
Yeah.
So now what? How's this work? And it's almost like Paul is describing something in Philemon as an example, as a test case, kind of, as to what he's actually arguing in Colossians.
You know? For people, maybe not every listener has read Philemon in a while or understands all the interest.
Right. Yeah, it's not the most popular book in the New Testament.
No, and it's really short, so you don't exactly spend like.
Yeah.
We're not going to get a summer series on Philemon.
That's right.
You know,
that's right.
Can you walk people through some of those? Just what's happening in the epistle.
Yeah.
So you have Paul, you have Onesimus, the slave who's run away from Philemon, who's likely a wealthy person within the Colossian church.
Exactly.
What does Onesimus' name mean?
Yeah. I mean, his name means useful, and yet, according to Paul, he's become useless to Philemon because he no longer belongs to him anymore. Well, he's escaped, I guess, or run away, whatever word you want to use. And so he's become, isn't that right? His name is...
I thought it was useless.
His name is useless.
Onesimus means useless.
His name is useless, and Paul writes him and says,
exactly,
useful to me. Sorry. And so it's kind of a play on words in this idea that, okay, well, how can this slave... And it tells you something about Onesimus, that his name means useless. The caste that he's in.
Yeah,
now he's converted to Christ.
It's always worth pointing out, too, that this is not like the race-based slavery of the colonialist period.
Yes.
This is a really different economic type of slavery you entered for. I mean, what percentage of the population of Rome were slaves at one point?
Yeah.
It's 80 or 90%.
Yeah, I was going to say 75%, I believe.
It's really high.
So they were employees, really, who actually could buy their freedom.
They could.
And
they had rights.
It had nothing to do with race. There was it wasn't like... these people were enslaved because of the color of their skin or because of where they were from. They were really born into it. It was much more of an economic arrangement. Now,
still not ideal.
Exactly. We're not justifying it, but it was when we think of slavery, we think of something really different.
Don't think of American slavery when you read about slavery in the New Testament.
Yeah. But the point is, he had left his obligation, and his name doesn't mean useless. And Paul in the book of Philemon says he's become useful, takes the opposite word and says, now he's become useful to me. But then Paul says, I'm appealing to you, Philemon, as the master of this man, to receive him back now as a brother, he says. And then Paul says, I could command you to do this.
Yeah, Paul's basically I gave you the gospel.
So I'm the one that's in charge of them. I'm an apostle. I can tell you this. However, I want to leave it with you and let you also see how he's become useful to us, and receive him now as a brother in Christ, which to me is that would fit into Hauerwas. Jesus obviously has changed everything, because this would not be possible outside of Christ. There's just no way. It would have been unheard of, and it would have been frowned upon, because you would be encouraging something that's not supposed to happen.
I think we forget how radical and revolutionary the early church truly was.
I mean. So the gospel penetrates that. So Paul is really describing that in Colossians 3, illustrating it in the letter that he also sends he sends these letters at the same time, to Colossae. And so the Colossian church is going to get this letter from Paul, and then they're going to get this case study from Paul right at the same time, which is really fascinating to me, which is why you probably should study these two letters together, really, I think you should. So, this idea that we've been raised with Christ, then Paul says, now because of that, radically put some things to death. That earthly nature, that undertow, that part of you that's so susceptible to this present evil age, the part of you that lives in the present evil age as its natural habitat. Paul says you can't tweak it. You've just basically got to say, this part of me has died with the power of Christ. You take up your cross, Jesus said. Paul will say in Galatians, you've been crucified with Christ. And so you put to death that which is ultimately going to be destructive. And what's interesting is I think the way that Paul puts it in verse 5, these things that are natural to our earthly nature, and he lists several examples of things like sexual impurity and sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed. All of these result in idolatry, and they basically are a condemnation unto themselves. In other words, if you engage in them and this really captivates your life, Paul seems to be saying, you will just receive the judgment of that already. But what you need to know is the wrath of God is actually being poured out in all of that.
And I think living in a society that's been shaped by Christian values for thousands of years, we may miss that some of these things would have been normative or fine
Exactly.
in the pagan society. Like even sexual immorality, lust, impurity, greed. Normal. Not frowned upon.
Right.
Just
even celebrated, I would say,
Yeah.
in the ancient world.
And so some of these were celebrated behaviors, not just, I think, as modern Americans, we would even look at this and go, oh, you shouldn't be greedy.
Exactly. Right.
Maybe.
Whereas
Maybe
in
we'd say
the end,
that.
it would have been honorable and really just kind of an expression of your rights and just who you are. And Paul is admonishing them by saying all of these things are a part of this present evil age, and you've got to so radically refuse them. The only way I know to put it for you to understand it is kill them.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very powerful way to put it. Now, Jesus to me said it a little bit differently. That's why I read that passage from Matthew where Jesus said, if you want to find your life, you lose it. You surrender, take up your cross, follow me. Lose these things so that you can discover what's really good for you and what's best and what fits into my kingdom. A little more positive way to put it. But Paul will say you've died now, with Christ. Then so your life's hidden with God now in Christ. And as I said Sunday morning, the more positive way to put that to me would be, well, you've been born again,
Right.
So there's this death that's happened, yes, but there's a new birth that's come with it. And so just a powerful, radical way to tell and I think a little bit shocking, but I feel like Paul is being appropriately provocative by using the imagery of death. People, they lived in a culture where they understood that. They understood death.
Life was very fragile.
Yes, it's just, my goodness. Think about how few of them lived into adulthood, and the ones who did, how short their lifespan was. There was just so much disease and war and, it was really hard to live a long time in the ancient world. That was the exception, not the norm, And then he uses a completely different image and says, just imagine these vices that characterize you. Here's what you need to do. Like old clothes, just take them off. Just rid yourself of these things that once again are just part and parcel to our sinful nature. Things like anger and rage and how we allow those things to control us, and bitterness and things that we know are absolutely destructive, but at the same time, they're just a part of life. Malice and slander and the kinds of things that are detrimental to the community in terms of relationships with people. And so you think about families that get caught up in cycles of anger and rage and malice and slander and look at how difficult things can be. Cindy got chosen to go to jury duty yesterday. And she didn't ultimately get chosen on the jury, but she got close enough to be sitting in on a potential trial, or I guess an inevitable trial, actually. And, just listening to some of the sordid details of this family and what's happened, and just sitting there and thinking, we talked about it last night. So today, Cindy didn't get chosen, but the trial started, and the judge there gave an admonition to the potential jurors, here are some things that I need you to kind of surrender a little bit if you're going to be an objective person, sitting here. But we were talking last night about how today that judge is actually sitting there, and this trial is beginning. And next week, that judge is still in that family court, is going to be listening to another one of these. And then the next week, that judge is going to be sitting there and listening to another one of these. It was like, my goodness, you think about there were, I forgot how many people were there yesterday. Cindy told me in her little pool, I think there were like 90 people just in her pool. There were many, there was a whole nother jury room Cindy didn't even go into. And all over that courthouse downtown were all these, individual courts, and some of them specifically family courts, if you know what I mean. And all of them have, it's not like they're looking for something to do today. They are log jammed, and trying to get jurors together so they can hear these cases and get them done. And I was thinking about that last night, thinking, my goodness, these families that are just riddled with anger and rage and malice, and then the outbursts that cause so much damage. And the next thing you know, you're dealing with the ramifications of it, and somebody's going to prison over it. And so Paul says, okay, these are very real things. Just take them off, with the power of Christ. And I would say we all battle them. It's just it's an ongoing journey to get rid of these clothes. And that's why I tried to use that imagery Sunday morning and just say, okay, they just don't fit anymore. These clothes don't fit, so just get rid of them. But the good news is we have a great fashion designer, We
do.
I thought it was interesting. I wasn't sure how many of those, I went and just did some research on the top 10 fashion designers in modern history, the ones that made the most money, basically.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me how there are a lot of people who know the names of those folks, but didn't recognize who they were. And I thought, okay, here's, Ralph Lauren or Calvin Klein, some of the most famous names in our culture. But when you see their photos...
Yeah, you don't think of the people, you think of the clothes.
That's right. So many people saw them and I have no idea who... Armani. Nobody guessed Giorgio Armani Sunday. And Tom Ford, who's the genius behind Gucci. And I think one person in the service called his name out. Everybody else just sat there and had no idea who he was. And I thought, isn't that fascinating? These folks that have shaped... think about what they've shaped, and nobody called out Donna Karan, however you say her name.
I have no idea.
DKNY. Her headquarters is in New York. So every time you see that DKNY, that's hers. Not one person recognized her Sunday.
Yeah,
so,
I did not know that.
Yeah. And so I just thought that was interesting. You got these incredibly influential fashion designers that are shaping generations of people, and they weren't recognized, but just the impact they have. But then think about how God's designed this universe, and it just all works. So I'm going to trust Him,
Yeah. I think what's really beautiful is God made clothes for people the first time they sinned.
That's true. Yeah. And I didn't even mention that Sunday. Yeah.
But this idea that God had to make clothes for people, God actually literally was a fashion designer in a very literal sense of the word.
For the very first couple.
But I there's a missiologist who talked about this one time, and basically writing about this intimate moment of God creating clothes for people. Mm-hmm. In their sinful state, they become vulnerable and prone to death and all of these things that sin brings into the world. Mm-hmm. But God steps in that moment and clothes them. And so then to think of Paul, and I don't know if this is what Paul had in mind or not, but then for Paul to say, it's time to take those clothes off. Mm-hmm. There are new clothes to put on.
Mm-hmm. You're living a new day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are not the sinful clothes the clothes God made for Adam and Eve in their sin. Mm-hmm. This is the new way. Yeah. This is the new thing to put on.
Mm-hmm. A new Adam.
Yeah.
Yeah. Put these things on. And to clothe yourselves with the things that, and I like also the imagery in verse 12 of Colossians 3, where Paul says, you're God's chosen people, you're holy, you're dearly loved. That's Old Testament language, and if you think about the church in Colossae, we're going to talk about this coming Sunday, was comprised of Jews and Gentiles, and how the identity for those people now in Christ, it's a new identity, and for Paul to use covenantal language was very intentional, I believe, for them to know you're God's chosen people now. You're holy, you're dearly loved by God, and so there's a certain affectionate message from Paul about how God relates to the church, which I thought was very important. And then the whole command, now let's put these things on. And
compassion,
kindness. Let's be characterized by them. Yeah, and I love, to me, when you look at that list, compassion and kindness and gentleness, it is, you can connect to the fruit of the Spirit, but I would just connect it to Jesus. You're basically putting on the clothes that Jesus modeled for us. So, and I didn't really bring that out Sunday because I felt kind of weird saying it. What I had thought about saying was, okay, so we're going to the show, but it felt disrespectful to me to say, and Jesus is the model who's walking out on on the runway, so to speak.
There's one of those atonement theories.
Yeah, so exactly. I was struggling with exactly how to word that, and I decided just not to even use it. But
there are times there's an idea in preaching that
yeah,
it's good until you try to put it on paper.
That's exactly right. So I just thought, okay, maybe not. But in a sense, though, it's like it's almost like God says, well, there he is. He's just walked down the runway. Where that? And then Jesus comes back again, and where that? And where that? Because what Paul's describing really are virtues that are expressed in the life of Jesus. And if we're going to be conformed to the image of Jesus, then those virtues that characterize Jesus should characterize us. And so that, to me, leads me back to the Gospels, to just try to watch Jesus. How does he treat people? Why does he do the things that he does? What is it that, and again, understanding there's a unique role that he plays as the Messiah. Obviously, Jesus is not calling on all of us to die on the cross as a sacrifice for the sinfulness of humanity. So that's not it. And my life's not going to be the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. I get that. But just watching Jesus, how he responds, and how he deals with people, how he manages certain situations, how he chooses to communicate. All of those to me are there for a reason. He's modeling something for us, and how he looks at people, how he listens to people. And to me, Paul's describing Christ-like qualities in this text. That's what we put on. That's our new wardrobe, But I also know it's not easy. And that's why I tried to point that out Sunday morning. It's just, it all sounds good, and until you get to Tuesday at 10 o'clock in that meeting at the office and somebody undermines you, or you get...
Yeah, and then malice looks really good.
It does. Or Tuesday night at the dinner table when all of a sudden the family conversation takes a really, bad turn, and or something's happened within the family, and now you've got to try to figure out how to deal with it. It can come unglued quickly. It just can. And so that's why I think this is an ongoing process. This is a journey. We're in this for the long haul. Yesterday we had a funeral of one of our long-time seasoned veterans in our church, and Dr. Wade and I and Tilly and I did the funeral together. And Dr. Wade at one point in the message just talked about how he had watched this couple in our church for all these years live a certain way. And he said it reminded him of Eugene Peterson's image that the Christian life is a long obedience in the same direction. Well, that's kind of what I think. That's one of the things that Paul's putting in front of us. You keep putting these things on.
Yeah, you get dressed every day.
Yeah, you just have to. So, and you've got to refuse some clothing. There's some things you just have to say, I'm not going to wear that anymore. That's not appropriate for me anymore. And
it doesn't fit me anymore.
Yeah, and it shouldn't. And if it does, that's an issue.
Keep praying for God to work in your heart.
Exactly. It's funny. I'd say the last couple of weeks, I've been listening to the Catholic channel on XM radio, because I'm wanting to hear some of the, particularly, they'll have interviews with American bishops about things, and I just wanted to hear, so what's everybody saying about the new Pope? The fact that he's from the United States, and there's a lot of optimism. There's just a lot of energy around the selection of Leo as of this man who's now Pope Leo the 14th. And but it's interesting. Today I was just listening to an interview that was taking place on the Catholic channel. I was driving somewhere, and the guy doing the interview said, "Okay, my take right now on colleagues, friends, just people that I know, there's kind of like a renewal in the hearts of so many American Catholics. And with this Pope coming from America, he said, but he went on to say, but I just need to remind you all, God hasn't called us to a 2-week joyride as a Christian." I thought this was very interesting. This is a Roman Catholic host. He said, we're in this for the long haul. He said, so I'm just saying to my fellow Catholics, the euphoria of the last couple of weeks of having a Pope here from our homeland, that's just not good enough. And he went on to describe, you need to do that. You need to be involved. You need to be reading your Bible. You need to be going to church. I mean, it's like I was listening. I thought he sounded like a Baptist preacher. It was really fascinating to me. But I appreciate his point that, okay, we have these renewal moments, which is awesome, but actually it's the everyday of life. And that's what I hear Paul addressing in this text, you know. And it is challenging to do. Because there's a newness to it, but it's worthy.
It is,
you know, to do. And then what I'm planning to do this coming Sunday is show how this is all connected, because we do all of this in community. You know, we do all of this together as the people of God. That's how all these virtues are lived out. Yeah. You know, they're not just lived out.
They're not even really possible by yourself.
Exactly. You know,
you can't do this alone.
No. I mean, I guess you can be compassionate and kind toward yourself, but
it's not going to.
I'm not sure that it earns any kind of respect. But the challenge of a virtuous life is the challenge of living in community, and so I'm looking forward to unpacking all that.
It's going to be a good Sunday.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, Colossians 3, one more time.
Let's roll.
I love it.
Well, summer is fast approaching, so beyond camp, and we'll probably talk about this again, but you've got your summer plans kind of lined out. What are the things you're excited about?
Yeah. Well, I am looking forward to the theme of the summer. You know, you are here, and the idea is you're here for a reason. And so you'll be preaching one of those.
Looking forward to
Katie, Ryan, Connor. I'll give us the first 5 weeks I will do. And then you and I and Ashley and there are other folks as well are going to attend the Baptist World Alliance World Congress, and which I'm excited about. In fact, a Sunday morning, Elijah Brown started texting me Sunday morning.
That's the General Secretary of Baptist World Alliance, for those who don't know.
The BWA, great guy, and he and I are good friends. Well, he started sending me photos. He was at the installation of Pope Leo.
I saw that on Facebook.
As a Baptist
he was on the stage.
Yes.
Representing Baptists globally.
On the very platform and at St. Peter's. And so he's sending me these photos, and he's just saying, "Hey, Dennis," he knew I was at church, but he just said, "Hey, man, you have to see this. This is where I am right now." And I'm, in between services, I'm looking at it going, "Oh my gosh," I'm writing it back. Well, and one of our kids that grew up in our church, Anderson Rhodes, or Oral Rhodes, is his new assistant, and he was with him.
This is very exciting.
Yes, and so the Rhodes family was at church Sunday, and their son was actually on the stage at Pope Leo's installation. So he's sending me pictures of all that, so I'm writing him back, telling him how proud I am.
Which, even if you're not like the biggest fan of the Catholic Church, that's a big deal.
Yeah, of course, to be at the installation of a pope, how often are you going to get to do that? So anyway, so Elijah was just talking about how just important this moment was, and for him to be there and to represent the Baptist family. And so I just wrote him back and told him how proud I was of him, and how that as we enter into this World Congress, we're talking about the gospel being proclaimed to the whole world. And what does that really look like? What does that mean? And how do we feel like we're supposed to do that? And what's the world even think right now about Christianity? So all that swirling in Elijah's head while he's sitting up there on the platform. So I was really proud of him, and I just several times back and forth through a text. And then I got pictures of Anderson, who grew up in our church there.
That's wild.
Isn't that funny?
Well, I think it's a good moment for Baptists to be thinking about that with Catholics. I think, especially given Leo, I think it's going to continue Francis's kind of trajectory of where things were going.
Yeah, so I think we've entered into a new moment, and I want to live fully into it. And so at this World Congress, there will be world leaders from the Baptist family from literally all over the world. And so it's just a unique meeting, only happens every 5 years. And so there are opportunities for conversation and fellowship and learning that only exist in that moment. So I think it's going to be beneficial for us in our church.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think so. So there you go.
Okay. Well, it's going to be a good summer. So pray for everyone who's getting ready for camp, campers, parents, our staff, all of these other churches who are joining us. Camp is such a huge undertaking, but
powerful.
has so much potential to impact so many lives with the goodness of God. So just be in prayer for everyone involved. It's very important work.
I'd say amen.
Okay, well, thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Tell Me More podcast today. You can subscribe to this podcast on your app of choice, or you can visit us at fbca.org to find out more information about the podcast and our church. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.